Today is the start of chapter 3, and we're going to be talking about section 1, which is the starting point of that chapter. Section 3 deals with a lot of migration, different groups of people that we haven't studied yet. The first group is called the Indo-Europeans, and they were really well known for migrating and then spreading really their culture, but more so their language throughout many regions of Europe, the Middle East, and even down into modern-day India. So we'll start with Roman numeral 1, talking about the Indo-Europeans. They're actually a nomadic group of people. They came from what's called the steppes region. Now, I will have a map here in just a second, and I'll show you what I'm talking about there. But when you think about the Indo-Europeans, one of the most important factors is to understand that Indo-European is really a root language more so than a place. And the root language of Indo-European gave rise to groups that migrated elsewhere, such as the Aryans in India, the Greeks, the Celts, eventually settling in Ireland, Italic groups, which eventually settled in Italy, Germanic and Slavic groups for the most part. There are some others. Let's take a look at a quick map, and then we'll come back to the lesson here just shortly. But the map is going to show you the steppes and where some of those groups that I just talked about migrated. So this region is called the steppes, this orange region right here. This is where we believe the Indo-Europeans originated, or the Indo-European speaking peoples originated. And then the Aryans migrated down in here, northern India. Into Anatolia, you have the Hittites, which we're going to talk about in depth. We're going to use the Hittites today as an example of a Indo-European speaking group that migrated and then settled and became successful. Now you've got the Celts and the Germans, Slavic groups. Then you've got your Italics, you've got your Greeks who settled in here in modern day Greece. And so we're going to take a look at those things as well. However, one thing to take a look at is the language system that comes from Indo-European. English is a derivative. Sanskrit, which is an Indian language. Persian, Spanish, and German, all of these languages are based off of the root of Indo-European. You can see just in the word mother how similar many of the other languages have for that simple word. Now, when we go back to the lesson, the steppes that I just showed you on the map, the definition of the steppes is that they are dry grasslands. They stretch north of the Caucasus mountain range. The Caucasus mountain range is located between the Black and the Caspian Sea. So here again, we'll go back to our map. All right, here's the Black Sea, here's the Caspian Sea. So the Caucasus mountain range is right here. Sort of separates the steppes from the modern day Middle East, or what we call Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey there. So a little bit of a geography lesson here to start off. Most of the people who lived in this originating land were shepherds. That means they herded cattle, sheep, and goat. They also were well known for utilizing the horse. They utilized the horse in battle, and they pulled two-wheeled chariots. The language, though, like I said, is the most important thing. And the language that they spoke is a version of what's called Indo-European. It's the ancestor language to many of the modern languages of Europe and the rest of the world today. Now, one of the things that the Indo-Europeans are known for is their migration, which I did show on that map. Historians suggest that the Indo-Europeans left their original land in the steppes for several reasons. One of the biggest reasons is a possible overuse of the land by animals, and they were overgrazing. So we know they were shepherds. The steppes are a dry grassland. So if you were to utilize too much of that land for grazing, that could become problematic for human food. Next is overpopulation of humans. As they have a great source of food, possibly they grew too large, and then with droughts, with overgrazing, that could have led to their necessity to migrate. Invasion is always on your list for causes of migration. In the steppe lands, there's a lot of horsemen, like the Huns, like the Mongols later, that kind of rode through these areas, taking slaves, taking captives, causing great devastation. That would be something to consider as you take a look at why the Indo-Europeans migrated. And then finally, a possible factor was disease. If you're looking at overpopulation, people living in tight proximity, if you're looking at the overuse of the land, a shortage of food, then those kind of link into disease. When people have a shortage of food, they can get sick, their body, gets debilitated, and they can be susceptible to disease. Now, overpopulation makes that disease spread faster. So it could be a combination of factors causing people to migrate out of the steppes. Now, the definition of migration or migrations, this is very important for the rest of the year. Movements of people from one region to another. It's very simple, but a migration is where people move from one region and they settle in another. Now, the Indo-Europeans migrated from the Caucasus region of the mountains and the steppes to all surrounding areas between 1700 and 1200 BC. That's kind of the time frame when most of these migrations happened. That doesn't mean that all of them happened, but that's a good bookend date timeline to look at there. Next, where did they settle? You kind of saw that on the map, but they settled in Europe, Southwest Asia, and also India with the Aryan group. An example of one of these Indo-European tribes that migrated, settled, and then became very successful were the Hittites. And that's what we're going to focus on in today's lesson for the remainder here in Roman numeral number 2. I'm going to talk in great detail about the Hittites as an example of one of those Indo-European groups. The Hittites, Roman numeral 2. They're a group of Indo-European speakers, obviously. They occupied what we call Anatolia, which is also known as Asia Minor and is modern-day Turkey. And this happened around 2000 BC. So we see on that bookend dates, we said most of the migrations happened 1700 to 1200, but the Hittites actually migrated a little bit earlier. Anatolia, like I said, is also called Asia Minor. It's a large peninsula in modern-day Turkey. It does jut out into the Black and Mediterranean seas. Now, what's important to understand about Anatolia, if you look at the map here, is basically all of the regions that we've been learning about in our class. Anatolia is smack in the middle. So it's a very hot topic place where a lot of people wanted to occupy. If you look at Northern Africa, where we started learning about the Middle East. If you look at Europe, if you look at Asia, Anatolia or Asia Minor, or also known as modern-day Turkey, is right directly in the center of that world. And during the ancient times, that was a very key spot to be in. Talk about that further here. So Anatolia, by geographic base, is very highly elevated. It's a rocky plateau. It's rich in timber and also agricultural goods. It has nearby mountains, which provide natural barriers of defense, but also hold important mineral deposits. And what I mean by that, mostly metals for the ancient people. If you have mineral deposits, sometimes you can harness metals. And that was good for tools and also weaponry. Now, the Hittites started as city-states, like we learned with Sumer, like we will learn about in Greece, and they began to form an empire in Anatolia around 1650 with the city of Hattusis as its capital. So Hattusis is a key place that you're going to want to remember. It was the capital city of the Hittite Empire. Then the Hittites eventually became to dominate the Southwest Asia region, which is kind of like the Middle East, Turkey. The Hittites occupied the region of Babylon, which we've learned about in the past, and they started to take over the region of Sumer, which was in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, Mesopotamia. And then they fought against Egypt for control of Syria. Now, this was an important battle that we want to talk about. The Hittites and Egyptians actually battled to a draw, and it ended up in the world's first documented peace treaty. Okay? The famous battle was between the Hittites and Egyptians. It's called the Battle of Kadesh. Sometimes you'll see it spelled with a Q. Okay? Either way, it's the same battle. It happened around 1285 BC. We're not exactly certain when the battle took place. We don't have a descriptive detail of exactly the year, but we believe, based on other historical documentation, that it was around 1285 BC. Now, we will come back to the Battle of Kadesh in chapter 4, but I did want to throw out there that it's pretty interesting to know that this group you probably have never heard of, the Hittites, battled the famous Egyptians, who, by the way, were under the leadership of Ramses II, the famous pharaoh, and they battled them to a draw. So they had to have been a very formidable force if they could battle the Egyptians in that manner. Next is capital letter D. We're going to take a look at Hittite adaptation. So some of the things that they changed as they started to develop. First of all, language. The Hittites were Indo-European speakers, but as they conquered regions through Babylon and through Mesopotamia, they adopted the Akkadian language, the old language of your boy Sargon of Akkad. And then they started to follow ideas from the Babylonians about art, literature, politics, which is government style, and law from the Mesopotamians. Obviously, Babylonians under Hammurabi had one of the oldest and well-used codes of law in history, and so they borrowed some of those ideas as well. The idea that I want to get across here is cultural diffusion or cultural blending. What the Hittites did is they took some of the things that they already had and they started to blend it with areas that they conquered. This is a theme that we'll find throughout the course of history, especially in the ancient world, as things are just starting to develop. One of the big advantages that the Hittites did have was iron technology. They utilized iron in warfare, and they also utilized chariots in warfare, and we will talk about those here in a moment. Around 1500, the Hittites became the first in Southwest Asia to work with iron. They formed it into tools and weapons of war. The necessary resources to create iron are iron ore and wood to make charcoal. These are available in the mountains of Anatolia. Now, other places in the world had iron. The Nok culture in Africa had iron. China had iron around this time. So they weren't the first to have iron, but they're one of the first groups to have iron weapons. Now, point number 2 talks about these weapons in excess. The Hittites excelled in the technology of war as one of their prime elements. They developed a war chariot that was both light and also easy to maneuver. Now, the chariot only had 2 wheels, and it had a wooden frame which was strapped with leather. The chariot was pulled by 2, possibly 3 horses at times. And then the Hittites also incorporated iron into the outside portion of their chariots to deflect spears or arrows. Eventually, as the Hittites go to war with other groups and trade with other groups, diffusion or spread, such as cultural diffusion of iron working, took place. Knowledge of iron technology traveled widely with the Hittites as they traded and fought for conquests over other regions. Eventually, though, the Hittites did fall. Despite its military might, the Hittite Empire fell suddenly around the year 1190 BC. The fall came from a great wave of invasions from tribes to the north. One of those tribes, we don't exactly know which one, burned down the city of Hattusis, thus ending the reign of the Hittites. Now, one of the things to note there is that those invading groups would have been coming from the steppes region and would have been other Indo-European speakers. Next is capital letter F. I did say that the Hittites used iron. There's recently a big question about, well, they had iron, we know, from grave sites and other documented things, but how much iron did they actually have? That is the big question that I want to pose. The idea that the Hittites used iron weapons and tools is actually very controversial in history. Many historians suggest that research showing recently emerging that iron weapons in the Mediterranean world actually began around 1200 BC. This is a time when the Hittite Empire was already near its end. Now, this is the question. How much iron did the Hittites actually have? Did every single person in their military have it? Was it just for special ceremonies? We know that we have found grave sites with iron weapons. The big question that we don't have an answer to is how abundant was the iron? I also want to take a look at women and how women were revered in Hittite society. Recent archaeological studies suggest that women held a very high status in Hittite societies. One of the ways that we know this is that we found grave sites in Anatolia that have included women that were buried with military weapons, iron weapons such as swords, spears, and other tools. When women are being buried with weapons of military, this usually suggests that they were in some form of leadership position. Usually you will see the swords crossed over the chest, which meant that they held some type of government or military leadership role. It's also well documented in scrolls that queens could remain as rulers of the Hittite city-states if their husbands or kings had passed away. Now, one of the big factors that led to Hittite success was their use of chariots and furthermore their horsemanship. They were great horsemen and they fought with great cavalry skill. So the Hittite chariots are believed to be one of the greatest reasons for their military prowess or success, in other words. At times, we do find chariots that were fortified with iron, like I mentioned earlier, but the army had a specific horse training system that specialized in chariot maneuvering, which made them a very formidable foe on the battlefield. This is one of the major reasons why they were able to defeat, or let's say draw, with the Egyptians. Just a few more pages from your textbook that I want to show you. We went over the map, but this is an example of a Hittite chariot right here. This is an actual inscription, a bas relief sculpture in stone of a Hittite chariot. You can see that there's a horse, and the horse has trampled over an opposing soldier here. And then you can also get a little bit of a clue. Let me zoom in just a tad bit more. You can also get a little bit of a clue that there were more than one soldier in the chariot. You can see a yeoman archer or a bowman, and then you can also see the chariot driver. So a little bit multifunctional. Now, the driver doesn't look to be having any weapons, but he's controlling what was going on with the horse, and he's directing the movement of the chariot. You can see that it is two-wheeled, so there'd be one wheel on this side and a wheel on the other side. One of the problems with this is that if the horse were to slow down, or if the horse were to crash, then with only two wheels, this is probably going to tip over based on physics. It's going to either fall forward or fall backward. But due to the torque pull of strings that are connected to it when the horse is moving, that's going to allow the chariot to withstand a lot of pressure forward and also side to side. Okay, that is the end of Chapter 3, Section 1. We'll get into Chapter 3, Section 2, which is going to expand on those other groups that migrated, and the language is spreading throughout the rest of the world. Thank you.